The title of the lecture, as Dr. Tessitore said, is Power, Passion, and Mark Antony. And I have to say, when he asked for a title and a subject that would go with the reading you're doing in the Tocqueville program this term, that title came to me before I had a very good idea what it meant. But it now seems to me about right for what was in the background of my thinking about the character of Mark Antony, and I'll just say a word about that. He appears in these two plays of Shakespeare that I'll be quoting from, Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra, and it would be wrong to say that he is quite at the center stage in either play. Brutus is the proper protagonist of Julius Caesar, and if you had to choose, Cleopatra is the protagonist of Antony and Cleopatra. The common sense of intelligent readers of Shakespeare over the last couple centuries, I think, has been that, and it's a consensus I belong to, so I don't mean to create a straw man in order to blow it down, that this character, Mark Antony, Shakespeare's not writing a sequel in Antony and Cleopatra, and the character who appears under the name Antony in that later play is not the same character at all as the one we see in Julius Caesar. To be crude about it, the character in Julius Caesar can be thought of without much surface injustice to him as a political opportunist, a demagogue, an extraordinarily eloquent and reckless politician who becomes a successful general in a civil war he helped to foment. Whereas the Antony of Antony and Cleopatra is a veteran and admired and also exhausted general in the longer imperial wars that have stretched out under the second triumvirate of Rome, which he's been a leader of. And he is also a lover. And the character is built up from the contrast between these two aspects of the character, love winning out even to the point of Antony's death. But as I looked again at these plays in conjunction with my title and commitment in mind, it seemed to me that there was a bit more in common between the characters in the two plays than I had thought, and maybe than other commentators have been willing to grant. And power and passion came to seem two sides of a single phenomenon that at least had some coherence. And after all, if you are a playwright, a thinking and imaginative playwright, William Shakespeare, knowing you have written Julius Caesar with Mark Antony in it, it would be hard to keep one conception altogether from having an effect and influence some echoes in the other. Let me talk about this is an academic or academically environed audience right now, so plot spoilers are not only permitted, they are required, and I'm talking about the two plays, so I need to remind you, those who haven't reread one or the other of them recently, of what happens in the two plays. Julius Caesar has, in the background of its opening scenes, the march of Caesar on Rome and the triumph within the great city of the first triumvirate constituted of Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. And the question those scenes ask is, will Caesar, becoming emperor, destroy the liberty and virtue of the republic by engrossing power to himself? The crowd, the Roman crowd, the plebeians, the populari, are his new constituency, and he might play them off against the rightful authority of the Senate. A conspiracy is already brewing, and one of its leaders, Cassius, a hot-blooded Republican, uses the spectacle of Caesar's intoxicating effect on the crowd, points it out, to draw Brutus into the conspiracy. Brutus, from his ancient aristocratic lineage, his family's association with civic valor and self-sacrifice, will be especially valuable to the Republican cause if he comes into it. But in their encounter, Brutus is rather careful and measured listening to Cassius. And in truth, I believe, he convinces himself in a soliloquy at the beginning of the second act, he convinces himself to join the conspiracy on the ground that military and political aggrandizement, such as everyone now has witnessed in Caesar, might well lead to tyranny. So, on the Ides of March, the senators in the conspiracy kill Caesar and send Brutus out of doors to reason with the Roman crowd and justify their action. He does so in an eloquent and idealistic short speech. Meanwhile, Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony, a very subordinate character till now, very much on the sidelines, has emerged from behind the scene of the assassination, literally behind the scene, and in shock and bewilderment has greeted the conspirators and wondered aloud what they'll do to him. They follow, in the end, the advice of Brutus to spare Antony lest their cause appear violent and bloodthirsty, and besides, Antony's loyalty, of course, if it comes, will lend legitimacy to their usurpation. But after Brutus's speech of self-defense on behalf of the conspirators, Antony addresses the plebeian crowd with a much longer speech of his own. He plays on the emotions of the crowd, which so lately had loved Caesar, and with immense cunning and dramatic skill, he turns them against Brutus, Cassius, and the rest, and excites them to a pitch of civil fury that plunges Rome into civil war. If the first three acts of the play have been an irreversible focus on the energies of a single moment, the assassination, that is to say, all leading up to that in a funnel-like plot, right down to the speeches to the crowd, the last two acts seem to exhibit a dissolution of the plot of the drama itself, corresponding to the breakup of the Republican idealist faction in the chaos of war. The very meanings of words like republic, virtue, tyranny are called into question by the corruption that political violence brings with it. The suspicion, the mutual suspicion that now seems the rule among the conspirators and also among the second triumvirate of Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus, who are ranged against the conspirators. The play ends with a battlefield confusion of signals between Cassius and Brutus, and finally the suicide of Brutus, knowing that his cause is lost. And then, over his body, Mark Antony pronounces a eulogy that surprises by its generosity as much as his speech to the Roman crowd had surprised by its seductive murderousness. Who and what is Antony is bound to be, for the audience, a question that lingers after the play. I want to pick out then, for this moment, before coming to the second play, 3 moments from Julius Caesar. And first, one that's not often dealt with in much detail, but is dramatically quite unorthodox, quite interesting, and both crafty, I think, in its insight into politics, and giving a sharp impression of the instinctive psychological skills, the manipulative talent of Antony in dealing not only with a large crowd, but with a small one. So he enters right after the assassination. It's a bloody scene, as we'll find out later. And of course, he's slated for killing too. I mean, he's Caesar's right-hand man and a young man. He could inherit power. He knows this, and he knows the conspirators know this, but he knows that he is known to have loved Caesar. So how present yourself if you want to survive? And how present yourself if you are Roman and want to be both sincere and noble in the attitude you strike, and yet effective in preserving your life in the face of these assassins. That's the trick. So here's Antony's entrance there. It's his first extended speech. We hear by him in the whole play. And it's the first one on your first page. O mighty Caesar, dost thou lie so low? Are all thy conquests, glories, triumphs, spoils shrunk to this little measure? Fare thee well. I know not, gentlemen, what you intend. Who else must be let blood? Who else is rank? If I myself, there is no hour so fit as Caesar's death hour, nor no instrument of half that worth as those your swords made rich with the most noble blood of all this world. I do beseech you, if you bear me hard, now with your purpled hands whilst your purpled hands do reek and smoke, fulfill your pleasure. Live 1,000 years, I shall not find myself so apt to die. No place will please me so, no mean of death, as here by Caesar and by you cut off, the choice and master spirits of this age. Quite a compliment at the end of that plea for his own life, which is also a plea for his death if they choose to take it so. And something as a stage direction, though it's done in words too, just as interesting has happened right before he speaks these words to the conspirators. He has shaken their hands one by one and spoken their names, Trebonius, Cassius, and you, Brutus. And as it were, as he greets them neutrally, not seeming to praise them, not feigning pleasure at the death of his patron and beloved Caesar, but greeting them face to face, he has memorized who they are. Then comes this speech of pity for Caesar, of begging for his death if they choose to have it, of wondering what's up. Move from that to his soliloquy to the corpse of Caesar. This comes after the conspirators have left. They've had an argument about whether to spare him or not. And there's no reason to believe that Antony is not speaking from his heart as he addresses the corpse of Caesar and is not divulging his inward motives. And yet, such is the character of Romans, he exaggerates on one side as he did on the other. Rome was a very rhetorical nation. That means that the postures you struck are the words that you mean, but they are public, and the posture is part of the sense of them. So when he calls them the choice and master spirits of this age, he means it. But Shakespeare means us to hear also that there's horror in the idea that these assassins are the aristocrats of the age who will now inherit the empire. And I think, if you ask me, there's an additional irony, because Shakespeare finds Rome to be a very foreign country, one that he would not care to live in, but one he is able to dramatize with enormous credibility. So here's Antony's separate speech, a confession of piety towards Caesar, which he hasn't contradicted in his previous tactical speech to the conspirators. Oh, pardon me, thou bleeding piece of earth, that I am meek and gentle with these butchers. Sorry, it's the top of page 2. Thou art the ruins of the noblest man that ever lived in the tide of times. Woe to the hand that shed this costly blood. Over thy wounds now do I prophesy, which like dumb mouths do ope their ruby lips, to beg the voice and utterance of my tongue. A curse shall light upon the limbs of men. Domestic fury and fierce civil strife shall cumber all the parts of Italy. Blood and destruction shall be so in use, and dreadful objects so familiar, that mothers shall but smile when they behold their infants quartered with the hands of war. All pity choked with custom of fell deeds, and Caesar's spirit ranging for revenge, with Ate by his side come hot from hell, shall in these confines with a monarch's voice cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. He wants that war. He wants it in Caesar's name. and his piety has, as its other side, rage. And the rage is not free of ambition either. An emotion could hardly be more complex, and this is the divulging of it. But now, after the bewildered and careful Antony of that opening greeting to the conspirators, and this rushed and impetuous confession to the corpse of Caesar, look how he manipulates the crowd in the middle of the long speech to them, which I have an excerpt of. It's the second passage on your third page. He has made play on the words honor and ambition. Brutus is an honorable man, saying it again and again until you get sick of the word honor and you can't believe Brutus is an honorable man anymore, and acquitting Caesar of the charge of ambition by pointing out all the generous, the benevolent, the philanthropic deeds that Caesar has done in the cause of Rome itself. But here he comes with the body, the physical evidence of the cruelty and the uncivil, transgressive violence of the murderers. It's a whole new movement of the speech, as one might speak of the movement of a musical piece, and nothing was ever more orchestrated than this speech by Antony. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now. You all do know this mantle. He's carried him out, and Caesar's lying there. This mantle. I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on. 'Twas on a summer's evening in his tent. That day he overcame the Nervii. Look, in this place ran Cassius' dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made. Through this the well-beloved Brutus stabbed, and as he plucked his cursed steel away, mark how the blood of Caesar followed it, and rushing out of doors, to be resolved if Brutus so unkindly knocked or no. For Brutus, as you know, was Caesar's angel. Judge, O you gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. This was the most unkindest cut of all, for when the noble Caesar saw him stab, ingratitude, more strong than traitor's arms, quite vanquished him. Then burst his mighty heart, and in his mantle muffling up his face, even at the base of Pompey's statue, which all the while ran blood, great Caesar fell. Oh, what a fall was there, my countrymen. Then I and you and all of us fell down, whilst bloodied treason flourished over us. Oh, now you weep, and I perceive you feel the dint of pity. These are gracious drops, kind souls. What weep you when you but behold our Caesar's vesture wounded? Look you here is himself marred, as you see, with traitors, and he takes off the mantle and shows them the naked body with all the stab wounds. Now, I want to point to just one, such an astonishing passage, one detail of it. The anthropomorphism of the blood running out like the river in some similes of Homer might strike you initially, but it's that knock on the door. Mark how the blood of Caesar followed it as rushing out of doors, to be resolved if Brutus so unkindly knocked or no. Caesar welcomes. There's a gestural thing going on there. It's as if Caesar said, Brutus, opening the door to him, waiting to be stabbed. If it's you, maybe I deserved it. If it's you, all is lost. And that's the rhetorical claim in what immediately follows, too, when he says his heart burst. He didn't die of 36 stab wounds from the conspirators. He died because Brutus's treachery broke his heart. So there's that particular tell against Brutus there. And yet, this same Antony, when he sees the body of Brutus lying dead by suicide, good Roman way to die, speaks his eulogy over it at the top of page 4, and asks whether this contradicts the protest against Brutus's break against piety in the previous excerpt that I read, or whether this in some way confirms it and finds Antony in a different mood, in a mood, let's say, more of passion and less of power, or more of reserve, or saying a thought that was in the back of his mind all the while. Because Brutus was generous in his motives, as Antony is not altogether generous in his motives. But one of the lessons of the play, and it's a lesson about politics and psychology both, is that we can't know ourselves so well. This was the noblest Roman of them all. All the conspirators, save only he, did that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only, in a general, honest thought and common good to all, made one of them. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. I note one thing which just struck me now reading it. It's not overstated. And many eulogies, I don't know if this audience is mostly young, so you haven't had to hear too many bad eulogies, insincere eulogies. But they are what you usually get. And he's careful to tell a kind of truth. This man was a piece of nature. He was himself. He was an aristocrat. He did what he did, however wrong, from motives that can't be called low or cheap or self-serving. So that's Antony, quite a complex character. In very elementary teaching of literature, a wrong way of seducing students into study of the subject matter is often to say, isn't this a character you would like to meet? And I think as applied to Antony, that's a very difficult question to ask, because the follow-up is, whom am I shaking hands with exactly, as he shook hands with the conspirators? And yet that doesn't mean that Antony is at bottom a villain or a treacherous character or bent on evil. He is bent on many things. He is at cross purposes with himself. But he's a very effectual soldier, and in that moment, that great rhetorical execution of the speech, a great politician, a great demagogue. Antony and Cleopatra begins some years later. Mark Antony, well into middle age now, a veteran of Rome's imperial wars, and admired by Romans, but above all, loved by the soldiers under his command for his martial valor. But he is impetuous, a creature of impulse in love as well as war. And when the play opens, he's been called back to Rome, called away from his passionate love for the Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. She dominates him in a way that no one else can, but her love for him is genuine, reckless, and selfish. And the first exchange between them brings this out, both in her jealousy of the claim that Rome still has on Antony. I'll read that in a while, but she mocks him with the lightest of stings, and he feels that he must respond. I think I'll read that now, just so you hear the different voice of this play, or rather voices, because I think one of the advantages, peculiar changes Shakespeare made possible in this tragedy that feels also like a romance, using that word in the sense of the kind of plays that belong to the genre of romance invented by later editors and commentators, but A Winter's Tale is often thought to belong to that category. The Tempest also, Cymbeline also. And Antony and Cleopatra, though it ends tragically with the death of two heroes, doesn't leave us with a tragic feeling, and that's one of the puzzles I'll be trying to get at. But here's practically the opening of the play. Antony's been summoned back, and Cleopatra gives him some back talk. You must not stay here longer, page 4, sorry, right in the middle. You must not stay here longer. Your dismission is come from Caesar. Therefore hear it, Antony. Where's Fulvia's process? That's his wife. Caesar's, I would say. Both. Call in the messengers. As I am Egypt's queen, thou blushest, Antony, and that blood of thine is Caesar's omager. Else so thy cheek pay shame when shrill-tongued Fulvia scolds. The messengers. And Antony, he's blushing, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Let Rome and Tiber melt and the wide arch of the ranged empire fall. Here is my space. Kingdoms are clay. Our dungy earth alike feeds beast as man. The nobleness of life is to do thus. When such a mutual pair, he and she, and such a twain can do it, in which I bind on pain of punishment the world to wheat, we stand up peerless. Nothing's greater than those two in their love. That's his reply to her chastisement, that he's following orders and becoming a military man again, and also being a standard issue henpecked husband to shrill Fulvia. And what does it mean that he blushes? She's told him the truth about himself, and the truth about an insincerity in his previous posture toward her. Think about what blushing means. When somebody calls your bluff in front of a party to whom you are answerable, that blush comes on. If I pretend to someone that I'm completely without interest in financial profit, and then that friend in passing conversation in front of a third person says, that was a very nice $3,000, Bromwich, that you reaped by investing in that dime store for 2 weeks, I might blush because I was affecting something else. That's not to say that I'm, a hypocrite, but I contradicted myself in a most embarrassing way, and it's there for all the world to see. And of course, Antony's betrayal of Rome when he's with Cleopatra and his betrayal of Cleopatra when he's with Rome is there for all the world to see, but he doesn't like it pointed out in front of his men. But his response is helpless. It is to make love to her in some of the most beautiful words in the English language. No, there's nothing greater than you. Let Rome in Tiber melt and the wide arch of the ranged empire fall, the empire he's been fighting for decades. Here is my space. And that word is interesting, space. Because you might expect him to say, here is my place, I belong with you, dear. Or you might expect him to say, in a more paradoxical, metaphysical mode, this is my empire, our household, Cleopatra. That would be hyperbole of a standard. But it's here's my space. Nothing traps us here. We're here because we want to be, and we can go outward to be something bigger than the world. And there's that sense about Antony and Cleopatra, that their love is of a measure that no ordinary calculus can be applied to. It's right there in the opening lines of the play. And this exchange, their love together is, how to say it, capricious, tolerant, and above all worldly, and yet it seems bigger than the world. In teaching this place sometimes, you say, what are they? Well, she's the queen of Egypt, and he's one of the triumvirate, one of the three most powerful men in the world as leaders of Rome. But what you feel about them more strongly, I think, is that they've passed beyond politics, outside politics somehow, maybe to a place that is morally questionable, if you want to ask those questions. They're stars, and everyone knows it. Nobody can take their eyes off either of them. The truth is that the second triumvirate, by this time in the play, has already, and much more and visibly later, has already begun to come apart. And its control and the leadership of the empire will pass on to the most prudent and calculating of the three, Octavius. The body of the play, Antony and Cleopatra, is given to Antony's alternations of moral resolve to fight for Rome again and defection as he leaves Rome for Cleopatra and then leaves her for Rome again and then repeats the process until by an ill-chosen final duel, a naval battle, the sea battle at Actium with Octavius, he loses his share of the empire and dies by his own hand in obedience to the precepts of Roman honor, only to speak his last words as a declaration of love to Cleopatra. I'll move on to a passage on page 5, catching Antony's mood of irresolution when he's punishing himself as he goes back and forth between these loyalties. But his feeling for Cleopatra deserves a stronger name than loyalty, and he would want us to say his feeling for Rome deserves it too. He's caught between the two. I have fled myself and have instructed cowards to run and show their shoulders. Friends, be gone. I have myself resolved upon a course which has no need of you. Be gone. My treasure's in the harbor, take it. Oh, I followed that I blushed, sorry, fluffed it. Oh, I followed that, Cleopatra, I followed that I blushed to look upon. That blush again. My very hairs do mutiny, for the white reprove the brown for rashness, and they them for fear and doting. So, I mean, well, you get it. I mean, he can't win anyway. He's wrong to fear and dote on Cleopatra, but he's wrong to have the, well, which adjectives apply to Cleopatra and which to Rome? It's actually a puzzle, isn't it? Rashness is there both in his love and in his duel with Octavius by sea. And doting is there alone in Cleopatra, but there may be fear that enters into both relationships. When Antony resolves a last time to stay with Cleopatra, even though she's betrayed him at the Battle of Actium, he speaks as if he's leading an army, the army of the two of them, and says at the passage on the bottom of page 5, I will be treble-sinewed, hearted, breathed, and fight maliciously, for when mine hours were nice and lucky, men did ransom lives of me for jests, but now I'll set my teeth and send to darkness all that stop me. Come, let's have one other gaudy night. Call to me all my sad captains. Fill our bowls once more. Let's mock the midnight bell. And she says, it is my birthday. I had thought to have held it poor, but since my lord is Antony again, I will be Cleopatra. And then finally the scene of their death, which could not be more operatic, with him having, and I mean, the opposition, the almost allegorical stress on the difference between Roman duty, the coldness and harshness and necessity of that, and love. It's uncontrollable and imprudent and endlessly seductive power. Shakespeare, who can be obvious when he wants, but usually doesn't go that way, actually makes it so explicit as to have Antony invite a subaltern to help him kill himself. That's the standard way, to hold a sword that he'll fall on. He doesn't succeed. He doesn't succeed as a soldier. He tries to kill himself, and the subaltern's name is Eros. So, and Antony will say, predicting this in a way before that unsuccessful, not immediately successful suicide, he'll say to Cleopatra, prophesying it, the next time I do fight, I'll make death love me. Having himself be stabbed by Eros is just the reverse of that paradox, making love kill me, but it can't. Love is the life of him. So here's that final scene on the bottom of just 3 essential statements from it on the bottom of page 6, where he says, I am dying, Egypt, dying. Only I hear importune death a while, until of many thousand kisses the poor last I lay upon thy lips. And Cleopatra, when he's lying dead in front of her, and she too is going to commit suicide, but not because there's life gone out of her with the end of Antony. There will never be another love for her like Antony. But she dies in order not to be taken captive a slave in Rome, or to be exhibited as Octavius's trophy, for whom she feels a deep repellence and dislike. So it is passion that drives her too, but it's not our normal idea of true love. And Shakespeare makes this quite clear in a number of ways. But here's her eulogy over Antony, as in its way impartial, but much more melancholy than Antony's eulogy over Brutus. The crown of the earth doth melt, my lord. O withered is the garland of the war. The soldier's pole is fallen. Young boys and girls are level now with men. The odds is gone, and there is nothing left remarkable beneath the visiting moon. That's a poetry about as great as Shakespeare can write. And he goes into a key of higher pitch and more Cleopatra-like exaggeration just to show that he hasn't lost her in his poetry. Because after this, almost before she dies, her words will be, "Bring me my robe, put on my crown, I feel immortal longings in me." And she has an idea of an afterlife pretty well worked out in her mind, in which possibly she'll meet Antony in any way, avoid meeting certain other people. I want to point out several characteristics that are, again, held in common between the Antony and these two plays, although they aren't decisive for establishing continuity, and I don't have any interest in doing that anyway. Antony is always seen from outside. There is that one soliloquy that I read out of him speaking to the corpse of Caesar, but we don't ever feel that there's a something undisclosed, an inward person in Antony. The way there halfway is in Cleopatra, the way there certainly is in Brutus, and above all in Hamlet. Shakespeare is interested in characters all across the spectrum. But Antony is the, what to say, alternation, the association, the combination of surfaces that he manifests. So he's both simple and opaque in that sense, and I think this is true of him in both plays. Cleopatra sees herself in Antony's idea of her, and she's consistent in that way. She is, the word narcissist has been used in so many negative senses, and I don't want to sell any of you on narcissism, but the act of perpetually seeing yourself in everything and taking pleasure in seeing yourself is actually, it's a seductive human quality, and she exhibits it all the time. Look at the passage on the top of page 5, where Antony has left her, but she knows he'll come back somehow because her glamour has a hold on him. And she says to her serving woman Charmian, top of page 5, "Oh, Charmian, where thinkst thou he is now? Stands he or sits he? Or does he walk? Or is he on his horse? O happy horse to bear the weight of Antony! Do bravely, horse, for wouldst thou whom thou movest, the demi-atlas of this earth, the arm and burgeonet of men. He's speaking now, or murmuring, where's my serpent of old Nile? For so he calls me. Now I feed myself with most delicious poison. Think on me, that am with Phoebus' amorous pinches black and wrinkled deep in time." And then she talks about her previous warrior lovers from Rome. "Broad-fronted Caesar, when thou wast here above the ground, I was a morsel for a monarch. And great Pompey would stand and make his eyes grow in my brow. There would he anchor his aspect and die with looking on his life." And I don't find the editors note this, but this is a record of a scene of lovemaking where she sees the men looking into her eyes as they make love and seeing themselves there. They too are narcissistic, and love is like that, and she loves herself all the more for remembering that moment with Pompey and Caesar and associating it with Antony on his horse, oh lucky horse. How to say it? The kind of importance Antony has for Cleopatra gives him the weight that we may feel is missing from the lack of an inward man in the external portraiture that is so consistent through the play. He is a character of warrior chivalry, and he has been made corrupt in his own eyes by love, and yet exalted by love, as that death by Eros shows. If there's another character in Shakespeare that seems comparable, at least partly comparable to me, it would be a Hotspur. in Henry IV, Part 1. There is a kind of parallel between the incontinent energy of Antony and of Hotspur as a warrior. And as there's a parallel also, I think, between the coolness, the calculation, the prudence of Octavius and Prince Hal, who will become Henry V. So what's the property missing in those characters, Octavius, Hal, Henry V? I think a good word for it, which is used in Shakespeare, not particularly with any prominence in this play, is magnanimity. These are givers of life because they are large-spirited. And that, above all, seems to be a property of Antony. And it's what we saw at the end of Julius Caesar. This was the noblest Roman of them all. And it's what we see, strangely, in his total forgiveness toward Cleopatra and his apparent lack of resentment of the Romans who have betrayed him from on high. Antony has to conquer Antony. And there is in that an idea of power and of love, different from anything else that Shakespeare has wanted to show before. So as I said, though, Cleopatra is at the center of the play. This idea of self-conquest, which you think of maybe as a modern idea and maybe associate with Nietzsche and other psychologists, it's there, I think, in Antony, and in no vestigial way, but it has to be read from the outside in. To conclude, this is a play, Antony and Cleopatra, often classified by editors with histories and tragedies as opposed to comedies and romances of Shakespeare. We can say it is a historical tragedy. But when you think about it, in what sense is it a tragedy? These two are, by the end of the play, and almost already at the beginning, too big for this world, too regardless of its claims and the prizes it has to offer. Theirs is a passion for which we need somehow another vocabulary than what we can use from politics or even from passion in the usual sense. Could that word be love? Anyway, it goes with a passion for conquest, a passion for conquest that hasn't died in Antony over the transition from one play to the next. But he's now much more a creature of passion in a sense defined by the romantic critic Leigh Hunt, passion being, on this definition, ardent subjection to emotion, ardent subjection to emotion. And Roman honor, if that's another subjection of Antony's, is real to him. Roman honor is real to him. That's one of his motives for committing suicide. But Roman power has become to him very strangely an indifferent thing. And this in spite of his politic marriage to the sister of his sharer in the triumviral rule, Octavius. He doesn't know why he loves Cleopatra. And she, well, love for Cleopatra is inseparably mixed with her sense of power, her passion, her glamour. Glamour, a word which is so complex in English. It's cognate with our word grammar, but it also means, what to say, a spell, an enchantment. And she has exerted that, we know, before him on Julius Caesar and Pompey. But how real that love is to us, even as we come to know its refractions in the medium of her feeling for herself. And she dies looking on his life and finding his life in another person. That is to say, that he lives on in herself, and her immortal longings are about, in a sense, not losing him. I'll stop there.
Student questions first.
Yes.
What aspects of,
I guess in comparing his passion for power and his passion for Cleopatra, how would you say each of those passions affected the way that he made decisions throughout his time as, a warrior when he was carried by his passion for his country versus now when he is captivated by Cleopatra? How does his decision making?
Decision making isn't a word I think the Romans used or that I would apply to Antony, but he is a consummate politician, as we see him in Julius Caesar, and we are shown evidence that he's an effective general too, including one of the most effective weapons of a general, namely jealousy of other generals or of his collaborators. And, I think one might as well say he makes all the right decisions in love, too, within his capacity. He can't be with her every moment. He's not your house husband in any ordinary sense. She doesn't know him as that and doesn't expect him to be. And their passion for each other grows with their separation. So if prudence and sanity are ideas of how to conduct yourself in the world, and they should be for most of us much of the time, this play is not good advice. It's not good equipment for living. But we're not asked, I think, to render a moral judgment on or against Antony or Cleopatra. Whatever we make of them as, what to say, walking representations of real human beings, so what would it be like to judge the real human beings? The play loves them. And so does every character in it except cold Octavius. So, that's a fact, and that's one of the ways I think, should we say, poetry helps to redeem reality. Nietzsche says we have art lest we perish from the truth. The truth about Antony might be something that would make us perish, but this helps us not to. Yes?
What about Othello, which is a play in which a character has a heroic sense of himself and his love? How do you see that in relation to Antony and Cleopatra?
Yes. Othello really is terribly deceived and self-deceived and is tragic. I think that play is almost unbearable. This is hard to perform, a different thing. But Othello has the office of one of the masters of the world, but not the actual knowledge of the world he's in. And his inadequacy and the shock of it, I think one has to take into account as an element in the tragedy itself. It's not just that he mistakes the nature of Desdemona and of Iago, but that he hardly knows the world he's been put in charge of on Cyprus, and it turns out to mean that he doesn't know the European world of Venice or its treacheries or its seductions. So it's a tragedy of a lack of self-knowledge and a lack of knowledge, and both are in question in the play. We're interested in, because he does talk about himself a lot and talks about his love a lot and talks about how he's talked about it, how he has used his record of his adventures to cause Desdemona to fall in love with him. Whereas there's no question, I think, in this play about knowledge or self-knowledge. It would be getting it wrong to want deep self-examination from either Cleopatra or Antony. They are reflected in each other's eyes and in other people's eyes. Her serving women, his soldiers, they all love them. But they also are very knowing about the world. And I think what draws us to them and at the same time makes us feel dreaming as we are drawn is that they have, being in possession of the world, thrown it aside. Now, a great English poet, only less great than Shakespeare, John Dryden, wrote a verse drama called All for Love about Antony and Cleopatra, called, I think, by a good critic, Northrop Frye, the second best play on the subject. The subtitle of All for Love is The World Well Lost. No. We can't feel that about our world, but we're allowed to feel it as we read. Yeah.
So I saw Ray Fiennes and Sophie Okonedo in this last fall at the National Theatre in London, and the passage struck me because she was doing a reading in a couple other places in the play where Cleopatra seemed frantic and worried and unsure about what Antony was doing.
She was jittery.
Yes, but you may have just answered that question. If she's waiting to always see herself reflected in him, would that cause?
No, I think she got it wrong.
Yeah.
You can't do that. She is full of energy, and she's seeing him, and of course, she's keyed up at all moments.
Yeah.
But she's also watching her serving woman watch her. She's always on stage, and there's no moment where she's not loving Antony for that.
Would you not consider Mark Antony in both of Shakespeare's illustrations of him to be impulsive?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the impulsiveness of a high-functioning plotter of great success, and maybe of no inconsiderable worship of success in his youthful embodiment in Julius Caesar, whereas he's a bit bored with success by the time we see him in Antony.
Thank you.
But there's more behind that question. What do you mean by impulsive? And I think there's a moral condemnation behind that.
Well, Shakespeare does paint very different images of Mark Antony in both of the plays, but in all of the performances that I've seen of it, he has that characteristic of being reactionary.
You mean reactive?
Reactive, yes, thank you. Reactive.
Give me an example. We all react, of course, but
Well, I think that he's so eager to give this once something of action had happened. He was so immediate in giving a speech to the public in Julius Caesar. And then in Mark Antony, it was like any time he heard about something from his wife or for Caesar, his immediate reaction was to go do something, like even if he felt like he wanted to stay.
yeah. You've made another connection between the two plays, and I think that's right. That's a consistency between the two rather different conceptions of a character with the same name. But in Julius Caesar, the impulse is more than an impulse. It's a political stratagem of very dangerous quality, quite on a par with assassinating Caesar. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war means I want to start a civil war, and I just did it, and boy am I glad. So impulsive is too weak a word. And whatever is utterly destructive and dangerous about it in that guise, that seems to have evaporated, not necessarily from the evidence Shakespeare's using, or even what you might want us to know in the back of our mind, but that's gone away from the representation of him in the later part. So, to say it another way, but it would be wrong even in Julius Caesar to play him as, move as very fast moving. He's reactive, all right, but he's a very effective statue reacting and saying words of a more impelling power than Brutus is capable of, or than anyone else is capable of. Whereas in the later play, I think, isn't it possible to feel affection, or do you not, for the character of Antony in the later play? Is that a word in my view that seems inappropriate? Can't get there. Okay, I don't want to.
Thank you.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the concept of love between Mark Antony and Cleopatra, because you mentioned, I think, 3 other words kind of related to the concept of love, which were passion, power, and conquest. And while
I don't want to relate power to love.
Okay.
But Cleopatra has power over Antony, and she's not purely a loving character. She's a queen, too.
And I think you also said earlier that Antony's love for Cleopatra was very related to the fact that she was a powerful figure, or...
I don't know. When a movie star is in love with another movie star, is it related to the fact that they're both stars? I don't know. I don't think I meant to say that if I did. But of course, she comes out at you. She's been the mistress of these 2 previous, members of the previous triumvirate. And, you know, when she chooses to go out, set sail in Actium, this is another insight of the critic I was using a bit, Northrop Frye. It's a very good perception. Says, why does he choose a naval battle? Why does she want a naval battle, which turns so wretched when her 60 sails fly away from the battle and he loses because of her? It's not that she's a coward, it's just a whim. She goes out into battle because it's picturesque, and Frye says she can be seen in a naval battle. She can stand on the prow of a ship. If it were a land battle, which they could have chosen, you know, you choose your weapon, sword or musket or whatever. If it was a land battle, she'd be lost in the middle. You couldn't see Cleopatra in the middle of a land battle. So she wants to be visible, and she has no trouble being visible. And Antony saw her and fell for it.
But do you think their relationship is more, I guess, indicative of passion or love, especially given that Antony continues, you know, when his wife calls, to turn away from her and then come back?
Duty calls, yeah.
So would you think that that's more indicative of great passion or of actual love?
I don't know that I don't know that. Let me not speak from my own experience or ask anyone else to speak from theirs. But I don't know that it makes sense in worldly terms altogether to distinguish and separate passion from love. But you have something, you know that, so what's behind that? It's not that you want to say he's not really feeling passion, or passion isn't really love, or it's something else is at stake.
No, my idea was just that, to me, their relationship seems more that of people who have a great affinity for each other, and passion and lust might be the
Lust.
might be the correct word.
Sure, there's lust. I mean, that the lovemaking tableau that I tried to bring out of the open without being seen, you know, is about lust, isn't it too? But we have to, but don't use lust as one of the 7 deadly sins. Lust in the sense of pure willfulness and exploitation in that medieval sense. You can read Shakespeare that way. At Princeton, 40 years ago, I had a colleague who said Hamlet was sloth. Okay, so maybe you're nodding. So, but if Hamlet is the vice of sloth, I grant you that Antony and Cleopatra are the vice of lust. But I just don't see that the play is that containing those characters.
Thank you.
You know, go ahead, argue. You don't believe that.
I mean, I think that there's a separation to be placed between passion and lust and love. And to me, the relationship of someone who isn't willing to fully commit to the other character, so Antony isn't willing to fully commit to Cleopatra,
Or to Rome, by the end.
or to Rome in the face of duty and in the face of Cleopatra.
Right.
It doesn't. To me, it doesn't seem like love, because love would be the idea of full commitment.
In a worldly sense, if I were speaking to, you know, one of my children, I would say, don't be like Antony. But this is a picture of life. It's not instructions to my children. And they're just, you know, this is, by the way, I mean, the kind of reservations you're feeling about Antony could be rephrased as objections to Shakespeare. And the French classical critics of the 18th century did that. They thought that he didn't observe the unities of time, space, and action. He's pretty good at action in some plays, but maybe not in this one. But they were keen on that. It all had to take, the time of the play had to be the time of the represented action, and it could all only be in one place. And, you know, there's movies that are, if you've ever seen Hitchcock's movie Rope, I mean, it's been done. You can observe all the unities, but it's pretty suffocating. You have to do it in every play. I don't mean to put that on you, but the moral objection was part of this neoclassical critique of Shakespeare. It's very strong, and I can't dissuade anyone from it. But I can't. You won't make me believe that he disapproves of Antony and Cleopatra in the language of vices and virtues that would write them off because, oh, this is lust. It's just, it doesn't sound like that. Or let me put it this way, you could read it that way, but if you wanted to write, so have you been reading Locke's Second Treatise on Government or anything like that? Well, I'm just guessing. So, you know, it has been said that that's a because of the arguments on prerogative in the second treatise, that in a sort of underhand way, Locke's second treatise is really an argument for monarchy.
Yeah,
And my answer, I know you, but I say, if you wanted to write a treatise in defense of monarchy, fine, and Locke might be sneaking, but that isn't the text you would write if that's the main thing you wanted to do. And if Shakespeare wanted to condemn lust in that medieval churchman sense, he wouldn't have written this play, although you can read it that way. I'll stop. I don't know the rate. There's a name for that vice too, some kind of incontinence.
I think another version of the well, Rousseau might actually condemn Shakespeare for this in the sense that this is a play.
Not even neoclassical.
Right.
Romantic French.
Right, but that this is a play that makes you fall in love with love. And that's the problem with it.
It's got too much passion in it, but Rousseau is consistent. I mean, he hates theater in general.
Although he says he never misses a performance,
I
which is
know,
very interesting.
but he writes the essay on the letters to D'Alembert. It's against dramatic spectacles. And it says that they set a bad example. And one of his main examples there is we do that.
Right.
You know, you're feeling all the passions of this mad woman who's murdering her children. Don't tell me that in sympathy. I don't want somebody to see that. And I do think that if you want to live in a society where adultery is not a commonly practiced thing, don't show people Antony and Cleopatra. It makes that pretty magnificent. Yeah.
Okay, good. What would be your answer on Shakespeare's behalf if we take this Rousseauan critique and we launch it at Antony and Cleopatra?
Yep. Oh, I mean, I just think if you want a fancy dodging answer, the play is so sprawling, episodic, and unorganized that it's not going to be very good propaganda for adultery or anything else. And Rousseau might point that out, but his confessions are pretty sprawling too. But I don't think any work of art that portrays acts that are not moral is exempt from that charge. I'm Platonist about that. I think that I've just written a book about it. I mean, I think that artistic representations are seductive, images most of all, but words too. And we are imitative creatures. What we see, we are tempted to do. Burke says that in his essay on the Sublime and Beautiful. What men delight to see in representation, they will put into practice. And that's a danger. But of course, it's a danger of human behavior, too. And you are driven back, I think, as Plato was in the Republic, and as Rousseau was with his invocation of the Spartan ideal, to an image of society that we don't find easy to bear. Difficult as it may be to have societies that take things like Antony and Cleopatra much further into much lower kinds of representation, pornography and so on. Yeah.
So Shakespeare seems to portray two sides to Mark Antony. One as a leader who will do whatever needs to be done, like a cunning leader who will do whatever needs to be done to ensure the success of Rome. And on the other hand, he's also just a simple human being.
Simple?
Not some very complex, but at the core, he loved Caesar. He loved Cleopatra. Do you think that was his purpose?
Sorry, I think that
His character's purpose? That was his character's purpose?
so that his ruling passion is love.
Yeah,
First for
the
Caesar, then for
the
Cleopatra.
context.
I'll leave that. I think that's, I almost said that. I think I had it written down and I didn't say it. I mean, that's a word that could apply if you take him to be sincere in what he says about Caesar. In his soliloquy, But nobody's listening to that. But of course, it's mixed. The passion is mixed even there. It's mixed with wanting to be like Caesar and start and win a civil war. So it's not just love of Caesar for Caesar. It's this love of power too. So I think what wins me over more about his love for Cleopatra is it's no longer love for power. She plays a game of cat and mouse with him. She plays with him. She is the cat, but he's her favorite mouse, and a big one.
All right, y'all, that's all the time for questions we have. There will momentarily, the magic wall will disappear and to reveal lovely snacks on the other side of it. This is our last lecture this year. Next year, our theme will be the crisis of liberalism. We'll be dealing with the travails of our favorite form of government these days. But that's it for today and for this year. Please join me in thanking David Bromwich for his wonderful work.